Imagine being a man who was not born to rule, a man whose life was meant to unfold in the shadow of his brother, the heir to the throne, a man who was suddenly thrust into the heart of the monarchy due to an unforeseen tragedy. His life was marked by family tragedies, political tensions, and inner turmoil. This is George V, the king who steered through the turbulent waters of the First World War, an era of profound transformation and challenges, both on the global stage and within his own home. In this video, we will explore the personal life of George V, from his childhood to his death, passing through his most intense family dramas, his marriage to Mary of Teck, the fiancée of his late brother, his friendship and controversial final chapter with Nicholas II of Russia, the scandal of his son Edward's abdication, and the reconstruction of a monarchy that had to reinvent itself in order to survive. He was a reserved man, devoted to duty, yet tormented by the tragedies both inside and outside his palace. We will see how royal dramas can be just as intense as those of any family. George Frederick Ernest Albert was born on the 3rd of June, 1865, during the reign of his paternal grandmother, Queen Victoria, as the second son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, later King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. He was third in the line of succession to the British throne, behind his father and his elder brother, Prince Albert Victor. George was not born to be king. From the very beginning, he was the second son. His older brother, Albert Victor, was the heir apparent and the focus of all the family's attention. George grew up with the certainty that his role in the monarchy would always be secondary, forever in the shadow of his admirable brother. His childhood was not glamorous. Queen Victoria, his grandmother, insisted on a strict and disciplined education for her grandchildren. She believed that members of the royal family should be raised under the highest standards of responsibility and morality, something George absorbed deeply. However, his secondary position within the family meant that he was often overlooked in favor of his brother. Albert Victor was seen as the future of the monarchy, charismatic, popular, and deeply loved by his family. George, in contrast, was shy, serious, and showed from a very young age a profound sense of duty, though he lacked the natural charm that made his brother shine. At 12 years old, George was sent to the Royal Navy, as was customary for princes who were not in the direct line of succession. He spent years sailing the seas, serving as a naval officer, far from the pressures and luxuries of Buckingham Palace. He found in naval life an escape, a place where he could feel more ordinary, and in many ways that period would define him. He was not expected to rule. He was not being prepared for it. The Navy gave him a discipline that would serve him greatly in the years to come, but it also distanced him even further from the heart of royal and political life. During those years, George likely believed that his life would follow a modest path, supporting his elder brother and never having to bear the weight of the crown. In 1884, after a voyage through the West Indies and Canada, the young prince returned to England, where fate awaited him with an unexpected love, Julie Stoner, granddaughter of the renowned Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, and daughter of a lady-in-waiting to George's mother, the Princess of Wales. Described as an English rose, Julie spent Christmas of 1885 with the royal family at Sandringham, where the love between the two began to blossom. "We are so in love, Julie. I can imagine a future by your side," George told her, dreaming of an engagement. However, reality set barriers in their path. Julie, a commoner and a Catholic, could have excluded George from the line of succession to the throne. His mother, the Princess of Wales, warned, "You are fighting a losing battle." With sorrow, the couple parted ways, pledging a lifelong friendship. George continued sailing for many years, under the command of his uncle, Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. During that period, he fell in love once again, this time with his cousin, Mary of Edinburgh. The love between them was young and full of promise, and the relationship received the blessing of his grandmother, his father, and his uncle. However, the battle for Marie's heart would not be so simple. The mothers, the Princess of Wales and the Duchess of Edinburgh, opposed the romance. This was because the Princess of Wales, fearful of the influence of her brother-in-law's family, saw them as excessively pro-German. The Duchess of Edinburgh, for her part, felt no affection for England, and the family conflict was palpable. Guided by her mother, young Marie ultimately rejected George's marriage proposal. George's passion, once again, was crushed under the weight of family traditions and obligations. While George suffered yet another romantic disappointment, Princess Helena of the United Kingdom, daughter of Queen Victoria and George's paternal aunt, made several attempts to pair her nephew with her daughter, Princess Helena Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein. However, those efforts were mocked by the royal family, provoking the anger of George's mother. Princess Alexandra, daughter of a Danish king, held deep resentment toward the family of Helena's husband due to their involvement in the Second Schleswig War, which had resulted in the annexation of Danish territory. The hostility was evident. Alexandra described her niece in disparaging terms, calling her snipe, a reference to her long and prominent facial features. In a letter to her son, she expressed her indignation. "So the Christians are chasing you with their beautiful snipe. Well, it would be a delight to have that beauty as your fiancée. Look at her, ready to conquer you, offering you a second-hand article in a gilded trap." These words, full of irony and scorn, reveal not only the princess's biting wit, but also the pressure George faced. True love always seemed to slip through his fingers, while expectations and duty weighed heavily on his shoulders. And without a doubt, fate had other plans for that prince. In 1892, when George was 26 years old, his elder brother, Albert Victor, died suddenly, shocking everyone. Almost overnight, that tall and charismatic prince tragically vanished. He died of pneumonia after contracting influenza. Albert Victor's death left a deep void. The entire country was in shock. Shops closed their doors, and flags were lowered to half-mast, a sign of profound mourning for the loss of a future king. The Princess of Wales, Alexandra, was among those most deeply affected. Her heart, already burdened by her own anxieties, broke upon receiving the news of her son's death. She withdrew to her chambers, unable to hold back her tears. Albert Victor's father, the Prince of Wales, could not hide his grief either. In a letter to the Queen, he expressed his anguish with sincerity. "I would gladly have given my life for his." For his part, Prince George was struggling with his own feelings of guilt and longing. In an intimate letter, he wrote, "How deeply I loved him. I recall with pain nearly every harsh word and every small quarrel I had with him. I wanted to ask his forgiveness, but sadly, it is too late now." These words reflected not only the pain of loss, but also the inner turmoil of a brother who mourned the petty conflicts of the past, and with the death of his older brother, George, until then the second son, found himself suddenly pushed into a role he had never expected, the new heir to the British throne. Yet fate still held another unexpected turn in George's life. Albert Victor had been engaged to Mary of Teck, a German-British princess of great virtue, highly regarded by the royal family. Naturally, the engagement was annulled after the death of her fiancé. However, instead of seeking another princess to marry George, Queen Victoria, who considered Mary of Teck the ideal wife for a future king, decided to intervene. She believed it was best to keep Mary within the family and arranged for her to marry George, the younger brother of her late fiancé. The Queen's push was decisive in bringing the couple together, even though the idea initially caused discomfort. For example, George's mother, Princess Alexandra, did not entirely approve of the marriage. Still mourning the loss of her son, Alexandra viewed the idea of George marrying Mary with some unease. For her, Mary's presence in the family, after the tragedy of Albert Victor, brought painful memories and a sense of discomfort. Nevertheless, dynastic pressures and Queen Victoria's firm will prevailed, and George ultimately accepted his new destiny, to marry Mary of Teck, the woman who had once been promised to his brother. Mary of Teck was a strict woman, deeply devoted to tradition. She was fully aware of the responsibilities and expectations tied to her role, and much like George, placed duty above all else. 1 year after the death of Albert Victor, George and Mary became engaged and were married on the 6th of July, 1893, in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, in a grand ceremony that united two figures destined to build a lasting alliance. Over time, George and Mary developed mutual respect. The death of his older brother also brought George's naval career to an end, and on the 24th of May, 1892, he was created Duke of York, Earl of Inverness, and Baron Killarney by Queen Victoria. He began receiving lessons in constitutional history. The couple lived primarily at York Cottage, a modest residence on the Sandringham estate, where they adopted a lifestyle more akin to that of a middle-class family than the royal household. George preferred a simple life, in contrast to the fast-paced, extravagant lifestyle of his father. During that period, he spent much of his time hunting and collecting stamps. He was a noted philatelist and played a crucial role in transforming the royal stamp collection into the most complete in the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Some of those stamps would later be sold for staggering prices. As Duke and Duchess of York, George and Mary performed various public duties. After the death of Queen Victoria on the 22nd of January, 1901, his father, Edward VII, ascended the throne. George inherited several additional titles, including that of Prince of Wales. That same year, the couple embarked on a tour of the British Empire. The journey took them to South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Newfoundland, with the aim of rewarding the Dominions for their participation in the Second Boer War. George distributed medals to colonial troops, but the reception was mixed. While some celebrated, many, including critics in the press, condemned the extravagant spending in the midst of local hardship. Edward VII wished to prepare his son for his future role as king, giving him broad access to state papers, a privilege he himself had not been granted by his mother, Queen Victoria. George, in turn, valued Mary's advice, as she frequently helped him draft his speeches. Between November of 1905 and March of 1906, during a visit to India, George was outraged by racial discrimination and advocated for greater Native participation in government. After that trip, he and his wife traveled to Spain to attend the wedding of King Alfonso XIII and Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, where the newlyweds narrowly escaped a bomb attack that left 23 dead and several injured. 1 week later, they traveled to Norway for the coronation of King Haakon VII and Queen Maud, George's sister. George and Mary had 6 children, and although he was a stern and emotionally distant father, he strongly valued the preservation of the royal family's image as a model of morality and stability. George's relationship with his children was complex. He held a traditional and rigid view of fatherhood, closely aligned with the values of his time, which often resulted in tense and distant family dynamics. The upbringing of his children was marked by strict discipline and the expectation that they conform to the responsibilities of monarchy, something not all of them could bear easily. The eldest was Edward, born on the 23rd of June, 1894. From an early age, he was a charming but rebellious and self-assured child. Although he was trained to be king, Edward showed little interest in royal duties, preferring a luxurious and carefree lifestyle. This attitude would soon become a constant source of frustration for George. Albert, who would be given the title Duke of York, was the second son and was born on the 12th of December, 1895. He was the opposite of his older brother. Shy and reserved, he struggled with a severe stammer that made him anxious and insecure. George's relationship with Albert was often marked by a lack of understanding, especially due to Albert's difficulty in speaking with confidence. However, following the abdication of Edward VIII, it was Albert who would take the throne as George VI and prove to be one of the most resilient monarchs in British history. Mary, Princess Royal was born on the 25th of April, 1897, and was the only daughter of the marriage. She was always a loyal figure within the family, playing a more discreet role in the monarchy. Her loyalty and discretion made her a key figure behind the scenes in royal life. Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was born on the 31st of March, 1900. As one of the younger sons, he lived in the shadow of his more prominent brothers, fulfilling his royal duties without attracting much attention. George, Duke of Kent, was born on the 20th of December, 1902. He was charming and popular, but his life was tragically cut short when he died in an air crash during the Second World War in 1942. John, the sixth child and the youngest of all, was born on the 12th of July, 1905. Early on, he was diagnosed with epilepsy, a condition that, at the time, was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. John was removed from public life and sent to live at a rural residence, where his epileptic seizures could be treated in private. His condition made him vulnerable, and although George and Mary intended to protect him from public scrutiny, they ultimately isolated him from his siblings and family life. The decision to send John to live at Wood Farm in Sandringham while he was still very young was one of the most controversial aspects of George's parenting. This physical separation also mirrored the emotional distance between George and his children. On the 6th of May, 1910, the royal family suffered an irreparable loss. Edward VII passed away, and George ascended the throne as King George V. In his diary, he expressed his grief. "I have lost my best friend and the best of fathers. I am heartbroken, overwhelmed by sorrow, but God will help me with my responsibilities, and dear Mary will be my comfort, as she always has been." The coronation of George and Mary took place on the 22nd of June, 1911, at Westminster Abbey, and was celebrated with the Festival of the Empire in London. In July, the couple was warmly received during a visit to Ireland. That same year, they traveled to India for the Delhi Durbar, where they were presented as Emperor and Empress of India. George wore the newly created imperial crown of India and announced the transfer of the Indian capital from Calcutta to New Delhi, laying the foundation stone of the new city on the 15th of December of that same year. When the Great War broke out in 1914, George faced a series of unprecedented challenges. The war was largely defined by two major alliances: the Triple Entente, which included the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, formed by Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. The spark that ignited the conflict was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria on the 28th of June, 1914, an event that triggered a chain of war declarations. The United Kingdom entered the war on the 4th of August, 1914, after Germany invaded Belgium. George V, as a leader within the Triple Entente, was compelled to take a firm stance against the Triple Alliance, and inevitably against his first cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II. George V was not only the king of a vast empire, but also a relative of many of the European monarchs involved in the conflict. His cousin Nicholas II ruled over Russia, while another cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, led Germany. Throughout the war, George played a vital role as a symbol of stability and leadership for the British people. He visited the trenches, comforted the wounded, and became a figure of unity during a time of chaos. Yet the war also left a profound emotional and psychological toll. The devastation of the First World War did not only destroy an entire generation of young men, it also shook the very foundations of the British monarchy. With the war, a wave of anti-German sentiment emerged in the United Kingdom, which became a serious problem for the royal family, which until then had borne the name House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. George's paternal grandfather, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, had granted him and his children the titles of princes and princesses of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha and dukes of Saxe. Queen Mary, the daughter of the Duke of Teck, also had Germanic roots. Although George had brothers-in-law and cousins with German titles, he always firmly asserted that he was British. But that assertion was not enough, and on the 17th of July, 1917, George, in order to appease British nationalist sentiments during the First World War, proclaimed the change of the royal family's name from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the House of Windsor. He and his British relatives renounced their German titles and styles, adopting British surnames. George compensated his male relatives by creating new titles, as he did with his cousin, Prince Louis of Battenberg, who became Louis Mountbatten after resigning from his high rank in the British Navy due to the anti-German climate. This historic decision, changing the name of the dynasty to the House of Windsor, was seen as an important step to reaffirm the monarchy's connection to the British people during times of crisis, but it was also a deeply personal act for George, who was severing ties with part of his own family identity. Furthermore, we can see in this the capacity and resilience he had to literally reinvent the British monarchy and ensure its own survival. And it seems he was willing to do whatever it took. George V observed, with growing apprehension, the rise of nationalist and socialist movements that threatened the stability of England. Amid this climate of agitation and uncertainty, his only goal was to continue protecting the crown and the monarchy. That same year, in 1917, when the echoes of the Russian Revolution reached his ears, the situation became even more tense. The deposed Tsar, Nicholas II, and his family, the Romanovs, were seeking refuge in the United Kingdom. But George hesitated. The idea of offering asylum to this fallen royal family, whose fate was intertwined with the same nationalism he feared, terrified him. He found himself torn between compassion for his cousins and the fear of political consequences. And this was one of the most complex and tragic relationships in George's life. The one he had with his cousin, Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. The two were very close. Their physical similarities and the friendship they had developed over the years formed a deep personal bond. They affectionately called each other Nick and George and maintained regular correspondence. However, the Russian Revolution of 1917 brought a tragic end to Nicholas's empire. He and his family were imprisoned by the Bolsheviks. George faced a devastating moral dilemma. Initially, he wanted to intervene and offer asylum to the Romanov family, but he was advised by the British government not to do so. The fear was that bringing the Russian imperial family, seen as tyrannical by nationalists and socialists, could provoke internal uprisings in the United Kingdom, where the monarchy was already viewed with suspicion. Reluctantly, George ended up accepting the advice of his government, not offering asylum to his cousin. But there is another version of this story. Despite later claims by Lord Mountbatten, who said that it was the Prime Minister who opposed the rescue of the Russian imperial family, the letters of the King's private secretary reveal that it was George V who blocked the rescue operation. Thus, Nicholas II and his family remained in Russia. The following year, Maria Feodorovna, Nicholas's mother and George's aunt, along with other members of the Russian imperial family, were rescued in Crimea by British ships. But the tragedy of the Russian royal family had already been sealed. By not rescuing them at such a crucial moment, Nicholas and his family were left at the mercy of the Bolsheviks and were all murdered in 1918. When George learned of this, he felt an immense guilt for not having done more to save them. This tragedy haunted George V for the rest of his life, a shadow that he was never able to completely dispel. On the 18th of January, 1919, his youngest son, John, passed away at the estate where he lived, never having been fully integrated into family life or society. At the beginning of the 20th century, the treatment of individuals with any kind of illness or disability, whether mental or physical, was often inhumane, even when it came to members of the royal family. And George V faced this harsh reality within his own family. John, who suffered from epilepsy and developmental issues, was kept largely in isolation, a reflection of the era's view of people who were considered different. John's tragedy led to criticism of how the royal family dealt with the vulnerability of one of its closest members, a son, highlighting the antipathy and exclusion of a society that frequently treated with disdain those who, in its view, were not perfect. John's isolation revealed a dark side of the monarchy, but it also showed that no matter how much status or power a person holds, human suffering reaches all classes, even the home of a king. And from the tragic death of his youngest son, we move on to the behavior of his eldest son, Edward, the Prince of Wales, who was a constant concern and frustration for King George V. From a young age, Edward showed little interest in royal duties and preferred a glamorous, hedonistic lifestyle, a true playboy who was involved in several love scandals over the years, much to his father's deep displeasure. However, it was Edward's romance with the American socialite Wallis Simpson that would become the last straw. Wallis, twice divorced, was a controversial figure, and George and Mary strongly opposed the relationship. For George, the idea of Edward, the future king, marrying a divorced woman was inconceivable and would jeopardize the very stability of the monarchy that he had worked so hard to preserve. He did everything he could to dissuade his son, but Edward was determined. George V's displeasure with his son's behavior and his fear that it would endanger the crown were evident to all around him, and they were well-founded. After his father's death, Edward became king, but shortly thereafter, he abdicated the throne, preferring the love of Wallis Simpson over the duty of a monarch. Fortunately for George V, he had already passed away and did not have to endure this dismay. However, he had been prophetic in 1935 when he said these words about his son Edward: "After I die, that boy will ruin himself in less than 12 months. And about his son Albert and his granddaughter Elizabeth, he said the following: "I pray to God that my eldest son never marries or has children, and that nothing comes between Bert and Lilibet and the throne." And if George V was a strict, distant, and absent father, he was an excellent grandfather. His passion in the final years of his life was his little granddaughter Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth II. Born in 1926, Elizabeth was the pride of George V. He saw in his young granddaughter many of the qualities he believed necessary to ensure the continuity of the monarchy: a sense of duty, a quiet strength, and a precocious maturity. Elizabeth was raised under the same strict standards of responsibility that shaped George's life. During his last years, George would spend long hours with young Elizabeth, teaching her the value of service to the nation and the importance of putting duty above all. He believed that she, more than any other member of the family, was destined to ensure the continuity of the monarchy. After the First World War, George's health began to deteriorate. He had always had respiratory problems, worsened by his addiction to cigarettes. The 1920s and the 1930s were marked by periods of illness, and he frequently retreated to his residence at Sandringham to rest. In 1935, George celebrated his Silver Jubilee, marking 25 years on the throne. Although he was still revered as a symbol of stability, he was already exhausted. The events of the war, the family crises, and years of responsibility weighed heavily on him. His health deteriorated drastically, and by the beginning of 1936, it was clear that he was dying. On the 20th of January, George V passed away at Sandringham Palace. It was later revealed that his personal doctor had accelerated his death with a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine, a practice he justified as a way to ensure that the king's death would be announced in the morning newspaper in a dignified manner, rather than in the less prestigious evening editions. This shocking fact reveals how orchestrated even the death of a monarch can be. On the day of the funeral procession that led King George V to Westminster Hall, a tragic moment interrupted the solemnity. A part of the imperial state crown, which had been placed upon the coffin, fell. The cross at the top of the crown detached and fell to the ground. The new king, Edward VIII, witnessed the incident. And like a dark omen, he wondered if this might be an ill omen for his newly begun reign. As a tribute of respect to their father, the 4 children of George V, Edward, Albert, Henry, and George, held the vigil of the princes, standing guard at the 4 corners of the royal catafalque on the night before the funeral. George V was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle on the 28th of January, 1936.